I'm Teisha Bader with Shalom TV's news update for Thursday, November the 7th, 2013. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has extended his stay in the Middle East in an effort to try and get peace talks back on track amid recent tensions between the parties. Kerry flew to Jordan today to meet again with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and will return to Israel tomorrow to meet once more with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. Kerry said at a joint press conference in Jordan today, together with Jordanian Foreign Minister Nasser Judeh, that both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas reaffirmed their commitment to these negotiations, despite the fact that at moments there are obviously tensions. Kerry also warned of what would happen if peace talks were not successful. He said, "What is the alternative to peace? Prolonged, continued conflict." Kerry said as long as the aspirations of people are held down one way or another, as long as there is this conflict, and if the conflict frustrates once again so that people cannot find a solution, the possibilities of violence increase. Kerry did express hope on the prospect of the talks, telling Jordan's King Abdallah in Amman today that his discussions with Israeli and Palestinian leaders had created some clarity on some of the issues, and that overall he was pleased. The IDF is investigating an incident that took place in the West Bank last night. Passengers from a vehicle leaving the West Bank village of Na'alin fired shots at IDF soldiers. As the soldiers pursued the vehicle, a second vehicle attempted to run over a company commander of the IDF unit. That commander opened fire and the vehicle fled the scene. No damage or injury was reported from the incident, and a search and investigation was ongoing in the area. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu reiterated his stance today that a nuclear deal between Iran and world powers would be an enormous mistake. Another round of nuclear talks between Iran and the P5+1 countries began in Geneva today, and Netanyahu addressed the issue at the opening day of a two-day summit being co-run by the Prime Minister's office and the Jewish Agency.
Israel understands that there are proposals on the table in Geneva today that would ease the pressure on Iran, for concessions that are not concessions at all. This proposal would allow Iran to retain the capabilities to make nuclear weapons. Israel totally opposes these proposals. I believe that adopting them would be a mistake of historic proportions. They must be rejected outright.
The Jerusalem Post reports that according to sources in Israel's Knesset, former Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman will once again hold that title. Sources said Lieberman would likely be sworn in as Israel's foreign minister at the Knesset on Monday and immediately thereafter resume the position. As we reported to you, Lieberman was acquitted yesterday on charges of fraud and breach of public trust, charges that were brought against him last year. Speculation over the cause of death of PLO leader Yasser Arafat is once again in the media after Swiss scientists issued a forensics report that shows levels of radioactive polonium in Arafat's remains and said that most probably those levels were a result of deliberate poisoning, but were not able to say unequivocally what killed Arafat. The Palestinian leader died in 2004, and Palestinian officials had accused Israel of poisoning him, a claim that Israel denies. Arafat's widow Suha said after the findings of the scientists at the Lausanne University Hospital Institute of Radiation Physics in Switzerland that it confirmed her belief that her husband was deliberately poisoned. She also acknowledged that her husband had many enemies and made no accusations of who might be responsible. The Swiss are just one of 3 teams studying Arafat's remains at the request of his widow. The other 2 teams are in France and Russia, and their reports have not yet been made public. The Times of Israel reports that Silvan Shalom, who was Israel's foreign minister at the time of Arafat's death, reiterated that Israel had nothing whatsoever to do with it. Arafat was under curfew previous to his death in Ramallah for his alleged fostering of the Second Intifada, suicide bombings, and other acts of terrorism against Israel. He was allowed by Israel to go to Paris for treatment after reports that he was not feeling well. Shalom said if Israel wanted to kill Arafat, they simply would not have allowed him to leave Ramallah. Shalom called the Swiss report unpersuasive and superficial, and added that if Arafat was in fact poisoned, it certainly was not by Israel. The Associated Press cited former Israeli government spokesman Ra'anan Gissin also saying yesterday, after the report was issued, that his government had no role in Arafat's death. Gissin said it was a government decision not to touch Arafat at all. He added that if anyone poisoned him, it could have been someone from his close circle. A Jerusalem magistrate's court today convicted the head of the Islamic movement's northern branch of incitement to violence, but acquitted him of racist incitement. Sheikh Raed Salah was facing those charges after an incident in 2007 when the leader arrived in Jerusalem and gave an inflammatory speech in the Arab neighborhood of Wadi Joz to a crowd of about 1,000 people. The indictment said that the speech constituted a call for and encouragement of violence. Immediately after the speech, the crowd began to riot and 3 Israeli border police guards were injured. Reuters reports that an Italian newspaper is claiming that Nazi war criminal Erich Priebke was secretly buried in Italy. You may remember that Priebke, who was convicted of one of Italy's worst war crime atrocities, died last month at the age of 100, and he was refused burial in several countries. And there were protests that occurred when Catholic splinter group the Society of St. Pius said that they would bury Priebke outside Rome. The funeral, though, was halted because of the protests. However, La Repubblica said today that Priebke was secretly buried in an anonymous grave in a cemetery inside the walls of an Italian prison complex, adding that the cemetery had not been used for burial in over 20 years. Apparently, the grave is marked with only a wooden cross and a number. No name or dates appear. The burial reportedly took place in late October after the Italian authorities struggled to find Priebke a burial location. Only a few people knew about the location, La Repubblica said, including a 3-member special government committee, the director of the prison, and Priebke's 2 sons. Government officials in Lithuania said they would offer symbolic reparations to nearly 1,800 Holocaust survivors. The officials told the Baltic News Agency yesterday that survivors will receive a payment of $622 this year that would also reflect compensation for, quote, suffering during the Soviet occupation. Once a thriving Jewish community, Lithuania had a Jewish population of 250,000 in 1939, but 95% of that population were murdered during the Holocaust by Nazi soldiers and Lithuanian collaborators. Today's Jewish population in Lithuania stands at just 5,000. A youth orchestra comprised of Israeli and Palestinian musicians will perform at the U.S. State Department. Heartbeat, whose goal it is to build trust between Israeli and Palestinian youth through the power of music, will perform in Hebrew, Arabic, French, and English in concert at the U.S. State Department tomorrow afternoon, and also participate in a Q&A. Heartbeat was formed in 2007 by Aaron Schneier during his Fulbright MTVU Fellowship, which allows students to work on a project abroad that will fulfill the program's goals of harnessing the power of music as a global force for mutual understanding.
But back then it was a struggle. Listen to the BBC.
And tonight on L'chaim here on Shalom TV, CBS News correspondent Dan Raviv talks to Mark Golub about the Israel intelligence agency, the Mossad. That's at 9 o'clock here on Shalom TV and ShalomTV.com. And that's Shalom TV's news update for Thursday, November the 7th, 2013. I'm Teisha Bader.